Whitestar Capital finds South Korea as a very appealing startup ecosystem for a few different reasons. Number one, very strong local tech talent pool that continues to serve the local ecosystem very well from a talent funnel perspective. Number two is the very competitive operating costs of running startup businesses locally in Korea. And third, but not least, is the really strong and deep bench of local investors that are now supporting the ecosystem in Seoul today that continues to develop and foster really strong lineup of Korean startups going forward. All of these factors combined, we believe that South Korea has many competitive advantages as a startup ecosystem to compete really at a global scale going forward. And the only thing I would add in here is that a lot of Korean startups today are starting to become a bit more aggressive about expanding their business abroad, whether it's into the US, Europe, or Southeast Asia even. So we feel like this is also a very promising sign of Korean startups becoming much more competitive at global scale. So my team and I at Whitestar Capital, we've been sourcing for investment opportunities in South Korea for about, I would say, the last 2.5 years. And the story through which we arrived at our first Korean investment into a company called Haimeri was really an interesting one where a lot of stars aligned together for this transaction to kind of come together for us. So back in 2018, when I was attending a local startup conference in Seoul, I had an opportunity to hear about Murex Partners as an incredibly thesis-driven investor locally in South Korea. Now, when I had a chance to sit down with Mr. Bum-Suk Lee from Murex through a mutual connection, I could immediately see why that was the case and why Murex was gaining that kind of local reputation. We continue to talk about some of our theses in digital health, respective in the US for Whitestar Capital and for South Korea for Murex Partners. And we could quickly see that we were seeing a lot of similar opportunities despite being physically present in two different geographic markets. Now, those conversations led us to speak about one of Murex's portfolio companies in digital health called Haimeri, which was at the time thinking about its next financing round of Series A. So we were able to naturally extend the discussion we were having with Murex to Haimeri, which eventually became our first investment in South Korea. Now, completely separate from this, I also had a friend and mentor in South Korea who was an investor for a very long time. I relied on him to gain a lot of insight about investing into the South Korean market. And right around that time when I met Murex Partners as well, my friend told me that he had quit his investor role job to join a very exciting digital health startup. Lo and behold, that startup was also Haimeri. So this is what I meant when I said a lot of the stars were aligning from multiple different directions. Having a close friend and a mentor also join a startup that a very well-known local investor was being bullish about really made me feel excited about the prospects of this company. And when we started diving deeper into Haimeri's business as a team, we were very quickly aligned with the direction of medical tourism, which Haimeri really services as a company today. So that was the way we got to meet with the Haimeri team and really got engaged with the company. And since then, we are now actively involved in the board of Haimeri as well with Murex Partners, and we're incredibly excited for where this company is headed next. So Whitestar Capital is a predominantly Series A and Series B investment firm, but I would on average agree that regardless of geographic markets, the labeling of the series financing round can get arbitrary sometimes. So as a general rule of thumb, I think it makes the most sense usually when founders and investors together label rounds based on how many previous rounds of financing there were for the company beforehand. So if it was the very first institutional round of fundraising for a company, that round can often be called a seed round. If there was a friend and family round before this one in particular, that one could be called pre-seed. And every round after the official institutional seed round, led by institutional investors, would subsequently be called Series A, Series B, so on and so forth. Now, there are other founders and investors every once in a while who label their series financing round depending on how much money they raise on that particular round of investment. I'm personally not a big fan of this approach because sometimes, depending on the life cycle, the maturity of the business, companies could eventually raise a smaller round down the road than they did before. So in that case, it doesn't mean the company is going from, let's say, a Series C financing round to a Series B. That makes no sense. So regardless of how much money is being raised in a particular round, I personally feel like it makes a lot of sense to call it in a sequential order of how many fundraising rounds the company went through. Now, from a perspective of a growth equity fund or a private equity fund, it doesn't really matter if a startup is raising a $10 million Series A versus a $30 million Series A, because eventually, by the time these companies come to the stage appropriate to growth equity and private equity rounds, they're going to be raising $100 million plus rounds anyways. But to the eyes of a early stage specialist investor like Whitestar Capital, who only invests in Series A and Series B, a $10 million Series A and a $30 million Series A are two very different deals. They send very different signals to not just us, but to the rest of the early stage market as well. So what I would encourage for Korean founders to do is be mentally aware that different deal dynamics do send signals across the table to investors, and be able to take advantage of it. Depending on how much money you're raising for your company, for what reason, think very carefully about how you can package that information to make your round really compelling to the eyes of especially international investors as well. On the topic of what kind of investors founders should generally work with, I tend to advise startup founders that they need to look for investors who bring very complementary skill sets to the table. So if a founder's superpower is really product, look to partner up with investors who can really emphasize sales, operations, or even financials. Now, I think especially when investors take on the board role as a board director or an observer on your business, it's incredibly important for founders to think about the long-term consequences of making that partnership decision. These investors will stick with you, all things considered, for a very long time, hopefully until the end of your company life cycle, until you probably exit out of the company as well. So try to partner up with investors who are going to support you no matter what, first of all, but also really support you by bringing very valuable perspectives and skill sets that you don't have today. Now, of the many things that Whitestar likes to provide as a value-add service to our founders in true Swiss Army knife fashion, the area where we really roll up our sleeve and consider our top specialty is really international business expansion. So historically, we've been most successful partnering with startup founders that share that vision of entering many different market opportunities, geographically speaking, without having to wait until growth equity round and beyond. So those are some natural synergy areas that Whitestar's team have focused on and fine-tuned with our startup founders and portfolio company CEOs very, very repeatedly. You know, I would say Spotify and TikTok are probably the more recent examples of non-American companies being able to mature nicely and enter the US market and grab a lot of market share and become very successful. But in general, I would say those are not the only companies that are facing a lot of success in the US market and abroad today. If I had to pick out two geographic markets that have historically done really well in exporting their startups to the rest of the world, I would probably pick Israel and the Nordic region. So with a lot of the Israeli companies coming to the US market, the top three examples that come to my mind right now are Via, Elastic, and Fiverr. And historically speaking, I think Israeli founders have been extremely strong in finding great product market fit, and they have this amazing playbook of leveraging that product market fit to really go to market effectively, not just in Israel, but in the US and a few other geographic markets, especially at early stage, and really execute on the growth plan that protects not just top line growth from a revenue perspective, but really reaches profitability, or at least have great ideas on how to get there eventually, even when the product is just starting out and going to market today. On the flip side, I would say Nordic founders are, unlike Israeli founders, much more sector specialized. So when I think about successful Nordic companies, of course, besides the massive example of Spotify here, I think of companies like Rovio, King, and Supercell, which were all early winners in mobile gaming. And that brings me to my next point of Nordic startups and founders usually being extremely strong gaming founders and gaming businesses. So unlike a much more generalist, commercialization-heavy Israeli founders, I would say Nordic founders to me represent a class of really strong gaming specialized founders, as well as startup companies in general. So bringing this point back to the original question of what can South Korea do as an ecosystem to further improve the exportability of Korean startups and founders, I would advise to either pick one of the two approaches here, whether it's the Israeli approach or the Nordic approach. Now, if South Korea wanted to go the Israeli route, I would advise both the government agencies, the various accelerator incubator programs, as well as the Korean founders to double down on commercialization efforts. How do you find and define product market fit much earlier on? And how do you leverage that kind of product insight and growth roadmap to enter multiple different markets, including the US, very effectively and capital efficiently early on? These are some very important questions where Korean founders will have a lot to improve on and iterate on as well. Now, if Korean founders were to choose and really take the approach of the Nordic founders and Nordic startups, and become a specialized ecosystem in one particular vertical or a market opportunity, and to really become the de facto global standard here, I think that's an interesting strategy as well. And South Korea definitely has few different opportunities here, in my opinion, one of which definitely could be blockchain. So compared to a lot of the industry adoption and regulation and policy work that I've been seeing in the US, I think South Korea is actually a bit more aggressive than even the US in terms of figuring out what role blockchain plays, not just in the financial industry of South Korea, but going forward for new innovation and new tech infrastructure stack in general. So if South Korea could take on the role of becoming the de facto blockchain hub of at least Asia in the beginning and the rest of the world eventually at some point, I think that's a very interesting value prop that South Korea has all the right building blocks for as well. So depending on which direction South Korean founders and various ecosystem builders want to choose, I think there are many different ways to do this, but eventually I think South Korea will continue to become a much more competitive startup ecosystem in the eyes of global investors and founders alike. And I hope all my answers today at least were helpful to a certain extent in answering a lot of the questions that South Korean founders and entrepreneurs might have before they start interacting with international VCs.